Koka Sunarai Sunarayanti 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 Koka Sunarai Sunarayanti.
Hello, hi, welcome to this new episode of the Mango TV podcast. Today I'm very happy to have David Luke. Dr. David Luke is a social professor of psychology at the University of Greenwich. His research focuses on transpersonal experiences, anomalous phenomenon, and altered state of consciousness, especially via psychedelics. Having published more than 100 academic papers in this area, including 13 books such as Other Words, Psychedelic and Exceptional Human Experience, when he's not running clinical drug trials with LSD, conducting DMT field experiment, or observing apparent weather control with Mexican shamans, he manages a small ancient woodland and is a co-founder and trustee of Breaking Convention, International Conference on Psychedelic Consciousness. He lives life on the edge of Sussex, England. Thank you for being here, David.
Thank you very much for having me. Nice to see you, John.
I'm very excited to have David because I feel that we share all the same interests, but you have researched them much more and went much deeper. So for me, it's an honor, and I'm salivating to have you here. As I quickly mentioned before recording, even if I hope to really go a little bit out there with cosmic consciousness and entities, but for the format of the podcast, I'd love to stay very traditional. So we're gonna focus on personal experience, on having a biographical arc in past, present, and future. So we're gonna start with the beginning.
Hey.
David Luke was born when, where? Tell me the childhood.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Midlands of England, on a council estate, and in the kind of very mediocre part of the world. It's right in the middle of the country. It's a very medium-sized city on the edge of the city. Not quite rural, not quite urban, and so everything was kind of quite mediocre.
What was a big city there?
Leicester.
Leicester.
So it's like 300,000 maximum, and so there was just not much going on. It was like everything was it wasn't really bad and it wasn't really good either. It was just like a pretty boring place to grow up, actually. So I had quite a boring childhood, I have to say. That's the most remarking feature of it.
Loving parents, present parents.
Absolutely, yeah. Big family, big Catholic family.
How many?
I'm
siblings?
the youngest of 7.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Same mother.
Yeah.
Wow, you guys, they were busy.
Yeah, they were very Catholic. The Pope wants more Catholics in the world, and
Wow,
they stuck to that very well.
Interesting.
I think my dad even got a medal from the Pope for services to the community, which means having lots of children, basically.
So, and you were the youngest?
I'm the youngest of 7, yeah. And they're all still around. So, I had quite a nondescript childhood in many ways, but I was, left to my own devices. And so I would just have, often just grew up playing with myself and just had a very fantastical imagination, had very vivid dreams, and would be, just kind of communicating with kind of imaginary beings and things like that. And
but you were lonely with 6 siblings?
Well, no, I valued my kind of quiet time.
Because at home was it was like, super solicited at home.
It was like growing up in a zoo, and so I was kind of became quite internalized. Actually, I actually started out with a stutter
as a reaction.
As a reaction, because I couldn't get a word in edgeways with my siblings.
Interesting. like Paul Stamets.
Like Paul Stamets. Yeah, I didn't cure mine with magic mushrooms though. It just went away after a while, but. So it was kind of quite an intense environment to grow up in, but so that naturally inclined me to kind of have quite a rich inner life, I think, and so I was always interested in the other, like magic and the paranormal and altered states from a very young age, I think.
How old?
Well, always, I think,
Since you can remember.
yeah, I was always trying to find ways of getting into altered states, with spinning around or whatever it might be as a child, like drinking all the parents' drinks at parties, hiding under the table and coming out to drink like half empty wine glasses,
Oh, wow.
and then started experimenting with drugs at like 10 or 11 years old, when I could get hold of them, and I would try everything basically, so I had a quest to get into altered states, always, and that kind of became a career, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But tell me more. So there was one specific experience that drawn you towards academia. Where did you go to college? What was the?
Yeah, well, I actually got thrown out of school for growing cannabis in the common room, hence my interest in altered states. And so I didn't finish my A-levels, my entry exams for university. And then I ended up running nightclubs and working on the roads and doing various jobs.
In where?
In Leicester,
In Leicester.
and didn't go to university until I was 22. I actually went and studied at night school because I'd also started experimenting with psychedelics as a teenager, and a friend of mine was a psychologist at a university, at Aston University, a friend of my girlfriend's at the time, and he was a fascinating character. He was like openly cross-dressed. We used to wear like little leather skirts and was always on these daytime TV programs as the expert psychologist, talking about his, obsessions with power tools and kinds of weird things like that.
Wow.
But he seemed to me, he had a really interesting mind. He was extremely bright, and just the way he would deconstruct the world through a psychological lens and come to understand it. And I thought, oh, maybe psychology is a way to understand, these experiences, psychedelic experiences, and so on.
Probably very free.
Yeah, yeah.
Without conditioning, cultural conditioning.
Well, exactly. Yeah, he was very much beyond culture in a way,
So you were on a nightlife impresario. You meet the cross-dresser, and then you decide to go back to university.
Yeah, a bit like that, I guess.
Cool.
If you could sum it up, I suppose.
And how did you pick Greenwich University?
No, I initially went to Westminster in London.
Yeah.
And I only got in just through the skin of my teeth through clearing because my grades were very poor.
From back in the days?
Yeah, well, I took my entrance exams again at 22, went off travelling, and my dad, bless him, he called me up while I was on some little remote island off the coast of Australia and said, I've got you a place at university through clearing. I was like, okay.
Oh, nice.
So I went to London,
Nice.
did my degree, and was
in psychology?
In psychology, yeah. And hoping to understand the psychedelic experience. And of course, they teach you absolutely nothing about these experiences. No. And so ran screaming from the academy.
Yeah.
And they asked me back initially.
Yeah. But maybe because we take it for granted, maybe for our listener, let's elaborate a little bit why psychology didn't teach you anything.
Because they don't teach anything about this whole range of experiences on the extreme of the spectrum. At least they didn't then. It's changed a bit now.
Like non-ordinary state, expanded state,
exactly.
telepathy.
Well, all of that. So parapsychology, altered states, psychedelics, none of that was taught on the curricula. And in fact, the general position was that any experience in an altered state or any paranormal experience was just delusion. Anything in an altered state of consciousness is an hallucination, and therefore we don't have to explain it, we don't have to understand it, we can just call everything out of the ordinary hallucination, and it might be pathological. Okay, maybe it needs some clinical treatment, but we can just ignore it because it isn't valuable. Something that scholars have spoken about, people like Charles Laughlin, anthropologist, he calls our culture a monophasic culture. We only value the ordinary waking state of consciousness.
Yeah, Stan Grof was talking about that.
Yeah, yeah.
But so before now, because we're already out of university, but during university, with your frustration with the curriculum, in the meantime, you were experimenting with LSD.
Of course,
And
yeah.
where was that exploration going? There was an arc. I mean, there was like something that was getting better, or there was some evolution in some direction, or they were all little chapter by itself. Do you remember?
Yes, I mean at that time I was and previous to going to university, you know, from my teenagers through to 25 when I finished my degree, I took a lot of LSD. I mean, a couple of thousand trips maybe, and anything else I could get my hands on too. But it wasn't really in a well-educated way, you know, in
Like
the way.
Christopher Bash, for example.
Right. It was kind of through curiosity and what we might call recreation. But you know, there weren't any guides around at that time. The use of psychedelics in a context of therapy or medicine wasn't really a thing. You know, we're talking up until the kind of mid to late 90s. Psychedelics was still very much taboo. There was no clinical research, no therapy. Shamanism and, you know, the use of ayahuasca wasn't really even known about or used then either. So it was personal self-discovery, and I kept getting called back to it, not as an addict, but just out of, you know, wanting to plumb the depths of consciousness.
Did you have a support group? You were doing it with some people, or was it a total individual
I
experience?
wouldn't say support group, more like friends,
Like
you
friends.
know, and festivals and parties and
Yes.
this kind of thing. So it was.
But then there was some sort of like discussion after, intention before.
Not particularly.
Not
I mean,
particularly.
we would talk about our experiences, but I was very, very curious about the nature of the experiences and trying to understand them, and then trying to put them in a Western psychological framework, which, according to my education, they didn't really fit. You know, there was no space for them at all, and so you know, I became extremely disappointed and woeful about psychology as a discipline. Because it was.
I did this claim that you're gonna hate me because I'm gonna insist on the personal experience. But of these 2,000 trips, tell me two that were more significant than others.
Oh my word! Well, I mean, I think my first trip in a way, because
yeah, of course.
you cannot anticipate the kind of experience you're going to have. You know, basically, a traveler had given me some LSD. It wasn't even like proper acid tabs. They were like, it was a sheet of blank cardboard with very rough squares drawn on it, and the squares weren't even symmetrical. You know, they were just like all wonky. Some were bigger than others.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Here, do you want some acid?" And I was like, "What's that?" And he said, "Oh, you know, you're going to trip." And it's like, he gave me a tiny piece of cardboard.
Tell me location and date, más o menos.
So this is in Leicester, in oh wow, you know, this is going back a bit, like 1990 or something.
In
like
the 90s,
yeah. 80s, late 80s, early 90s, and I had no context for it. It was like, how is a small piece of cardboard going to do anything to me, right? You know, and of course, it absolutely blew my mind and was extraordinary. And having kind of rainbow trailed vapor trails coming off everything, and synesthesia, you know, seeing your laughter as kind of echoes of rainbows. You know, this was astonishing and hilarious and beautiful, beyond what I was able to imagine. And then it also became quite difficult because it seemed to just go on for ages. You know, there was no context, there was no knowing. Nobody told you, oh, it'll wear off after 8 hours or so.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, okay, this thing goes on forever. So
synesthesia is what you remember. But did you feel you travel to different dimension?
not especially on that experience. And the thing about LSD and most of my LSD experiences, they were not especially cosmic, but you know, very much a journey into one's own mind and deconstructing reality and deconstructing culture and deconstructing society and deconstructing psychology. You know, seeing things in a way from a different perspective with clarity of seeing, okay, that this isn't the way humans are. This is just how we act and are with each other, you know.
Did you have an insight on your 6 siblings?
Oh my God. Yeah, they confused me even more,
Even
I think.
You
Yeah.
didn't see like maybe some of your behavior and your pattern as a reaction or a consequence?
Yeah, to some extent. I think I know. I think without a kind of mirror to bounce things off, and I think this is where the benefit of therapy comes in. You can have a lot of great insights about other people and things, but sometimes we can be a little bit blind to our own
Of course.
behaviors. And I was still very young and still discovering myself in the world. But so my adolescence was fueled by my use of LSD primarily. And so, my worldview was kind of formed out of that. And so, yeah, it's complex, because I felt very detached from mainstream culture and consensus reality and society because I was having so many extraordinary experiences, which I found everything in the consensus reality to be very prosaic and, dull and commercial and blinkered. And
So in your vision, how was humans interacting in those LSD sessions? There was a different way to relate to each other?
well, I think I began to see how politicized everything was, and how hierarchical, and how systems of control and
Fear.
yeah, and literally, and how media shaped everybody, and strove to kind of go beyond that, and also, simultaneously having a deeper yearning for a stronger, deeper connection with nature and our more kind of intrinsic primordial self, really. I was being drawn towards a kind of animism and paganism very strongly, and feeling like the modern world had completely lost that.
Yeah. So let's go in, since you mentioned it. I wanted to maybe talk about it a bit later, but you call it ecological consciousness. But so imagine you're speaking with a bunch of children. Explain in simple term animism, panpsychism, ecological consciousness, and yeah.
Well, I think it'd actually be easier to explain this to children.
Yeah,
because they're-
exactly. Yeah. Because they know less.
Exactly. But children are inherently animist, panpsychist,
Yes.
and
And present,
connected to nature,
Yeah.
given the opportunity.
Yeah.
I think that's what gets socialized out of us.
Yeah.
So, ecological consciousness, I refer to in terms of having a connection to nature, identifying that we are a part of nature, not
Yeah.
apart from nature.
Yeah.
That nature and culture inherently are the same thing, but in our kind of worldview, culture and nature have been separated out, and there's the man-made constructed world, and then there is the natural world of this thing out there,
Yeah.
which we either exploit or are scared of, and we have this deep disconnection from the natural world. Animism, of course, is the inherent belief that everything possesses a sentience, including other species, but also inanimate things like rocks or waterfalls or rivers. And that's related to the metaphysical position of panpsychism, which is the belief that everything is inherently conscious, although most panpsychist philosophers usually draw the line at inanimate aggregate objects like rocks. They believe maybe at a molecular level things are conscious, but not, a rock doesn't have an identity as a rock, perhaps. So, and these tie very much in with indigenous traditional worldviews of these peoples around the world still, and probably for thousands of years, who've made use of altered states and have this deep connection with nature. Not just a deep connection, they are a part of nature, not apart from it.
Yeah. Yeah, like the Kogi, for example, when they say that the river is their brother or the mountain, they don't mean it metaphorically. They mean it like literally.
Absolutely.
On a molecular connection.
Absolutely.
And, there's this incredible story of a Kogi going to this, electronic telescope in Greenwich somewhere. And, on this chart from the from the sky they recognize a certain pattern that happen every 10,000 years. That the astronomers like, how does he know?
Amazing.
It's crazy.
Yeah, amazing.
Okay, we're gonna go back a little bit on how the limitation in our ontology, epistemology, in the scientific materialism, I think, is really an obstacle of integrating this medicine in the West.
Yeah.
I want to go deep on that, but just to finish on the biography, if you don't mind, you're out of psychology in Westminster. You're frustrated because they don't explain all the interesting phenomena you wanted to explore. And then what happened?
Well, so I was going to run screaming from the academy, but they asked me back to teach, which was a little bit unprecedented because I only just graduated with my undergraduate degree and I was teaching master's students. And
But so you were good at it.
yeah, I guess I was good at it. I excelled in my degree with very little work. In fact, I was off surfing most of the time and dropping acid.
So you're still interested, though.
Yes, well, because I have a passion for it. I can do the science. I just objected to the implicit worldview that came with it and the denial of the other.
But you like the science, or you like the exploration of the psyche?
Yes, both. Also the science, because I'm a bit geeky like that, but also like the methods of psychology and how it can help us understand these things if it weren't for the prejudices inherent within science and the academy. So I tried to leave. I ended up back for a year just lecturing, and then on the way into university one day to teach, I had this kind of like flash of inspiration, like a bolt of lightning. It was like, and this voice told me, okay, you need to go to Mexico and you need to study shamanism. Okay. And so I was like, well, I didn't know anything about Mexico. I actually thought they spoke Mexican, right? Not even Spanish. I didn't have a very good education. And I didn't know anything much particularly about shamanism either. And so I left the university teaching.
Because your psychedelic exploration were mostly with LSD, no mushroom?
Mostly. But because at this time, you certainly wouldn't come across peyote. Ayahuasca was still mostly unheard of at that point.
There was no mushrooms?
There were mushrooms. You could get mushrooms. You could go and pick mushrooms. I picked mushrooms in the UK, but there was no cosmology. There was no context to the use of these things within a shamanic envelope, right? So it was a very different, but it was something I was yearning for. It felt like coming from deep within.
Yeah, people don't realize how recent is this thing. Imagine in the 90s, you were like an intellectual, so you had access to people that would intellectualize about this medicine, this plant, and still you couldn't find anybody that can contextualize it for you.
No, definitely not. Though
London, not even.
Not even in London. I mean, I think some of the earliest groups operating in the UK were probably starting up in the 90s. And that would have been some of the Brazilian churches. Most likely. Not within a kind of shamanic. We weren't having visits from various Amazonian tribes at that time. No way.
Yeah, of course. I'm just saying, sometimes we have to also to give us a break. If we're not doing everything right with this new technology, it's very recent.
Absolutely, and we're very lucky now, I think.
Okay, so you had this download. Later we can maybe discuss where it come from. And so you pack your bag, you go to Mexico.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
A lot happened.
Yeah, I know.
I planned to travel down through the whole of the Americas, but I got stuck in Mexico for like a year and a half, and
Huicholes.
Yeah, I didn't connect with the Huicholes then at that time. I wanted to. I went to the desert. I went to pick peyote, and the Huicholes were there in the town in Real de Catorce, but they were very close to outsiders. Actually my Spanish wasn't very good, but that didn't really matter. They had this kind of force field around them of like, we don't want to interact with outsiders, and including Mexicans, not just gringos. Like they very much kept themselves, as they had done for 500 years, Spanish occupation or whatever, in their view. They've contained their traditions and maintained them by remaining distant from the outside world, right? right, for 500 years. So they weren't interested in letting some gringo kind of come up to them and
Like the
inquire.
corgi, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, but I traveled around Mexico, and instead of having a lonely planet, I had Plants of the Gods. If you know this book,
Yes.
yeah, that was like
Gordon Watson.
Yeah, boss. Yeah. No. Schultes, Hoffman, and the later edition had.
I see.
I've forgotten his name.
Yeah.
Temporarily, the German guy. It was the Schultes and Hoffman book,
Yeah.
and it's like a ethnobotany of psychedelic plants around the world. They had over 100 psychoactive plants in there, half of which are in Mexico.
Yeah.
So I use that as my guide around Mexico.
Asking for people I want to do. I want to find this church.
Yeah.
I want to find this plant.
Exactly that.
And you find a lot. Like Maria Sabina was still alive then?
No, not at all. But I went to Weltler. I went to all the various places, and the extraordinary thing is, even now in Mexico, there's about 70 different language groups, and lots of indigenous people and communities, and most of them, or many of them, have use of some kind of psychoactive plants. And there's like literally dozens of psychedelic shamanic plants there in use still. And so it's kind of like the psychedelic navel of the world, really.
Oh, wow.
And so that was my kind of rough.
More than the Amazon forest, you think?
Well, potentially, at least at that time, that were known of and documented.
Yeah.
And that may be the proximity of Mexico to the States, where a lot of the researchers are. But there was a lot more documented psychedelic plants back then.
Okay. So again, what was the most memorable experience for you?
I mean, I pretty much tripped most days for that time. I also kind of stumbled across this psychedelic conference in Palenque, the famous Palenque conferences in kind of 99. And there was Terence McKenna, Jonathan Ott, all of these extraordinary characters.
Where you think all day and then you trip all night.
Yeah, exactly. There was Paul Stamets was there. There was
the intelligentsia.
McKenna. Yeah, there was all these kind of the entheogentia, right? As was there.
Entheogentia.
Yeah,
Nice.
and they were still outside of the academy because there was nothing happening in the universities at this point, and this was the kind of only psychedelic event, and they'd hold out in this kind of lovely hotel for a couple of weeks, just giving talks, and I encountered all of these characters, and it was like, oh wow, there's people like really exploring this.
You haven't heard about any of them?
I knew of them, actually. I knew of some of them just through reading, like this is the early days of the internet back then. Everything was still in DOS pretty much, right? Like I was on a listserv for kind of maps at that time. So you'd get these kind of online, you get an email newsletter, right? So I was kind of aware of these guys, but didn't really have access to the books or their writings and stuff. And so that was a real eye-opener, really mind-blowing experience to sit there tripping with Terence McKenna the year before he died and just kind of get some downloads from these guys about, and also as them as examples of, how you can like have these interests and still, make a career out of it too, which was important.
You don't remember a specific strong experience? I mean, you guys, you see, there was a story that I heard about the little man and the dead people. What happened the last night in Palenque?
The little man and the dead people.
You told the story in one of your podcasts. I don't know if it was Palenque.
Oh, that might have been in Brazil.
When they spike.
That was later in Brazil, yeah.
Okay, so let's finish with Palenque.
But Palenque,
I'd love to know something. How did you feel?
I mean, just very, very high. But we were tripping hard every day, and there was also happened to be some of the world's leading underground psychedelic chemists were there. And so there was access not just to magic mushrooms, which were growing wild there, lots of LSD, but there was lots of kind of research chemicals around as well. And so we just got to explore different psychedelics every day for weeks on
But
end.
that was too much, maybe, right?
Well, I mean, it was certainly a life-changing few months, you know, and many, many extraordinary things happened. And I think I could generalize in that we traveled around. We bought an old beat-up old Chevy, and we drove around Mexico, and we just tripped hard a lot of the time, me and my friends. And, you know, we're just experiencing magic on a daily level, you know, where you're constantly in this altered state in a magical reality.
Yeah, like Burning Man for me, I
Yeah,
think.
exactly. But I think just keep it going for months.
Yeah.
And, you know, the boundaries of your reality start to dissolve somewhat, and that
I see.
like anything becomes possible. You know, you think something and then it happens, and I started to inspect the subtle and powerful interplay between our minds and our environment, and began to experience magic on a daily basis. You know, what we might call magic.
This is super interesting. But so let's dig a little bit on that. So Jung would call it synchronicities. So this idea that, you know, with your mind you can affect your reality. How do you feel about the double slit experiment? Is this relevant to this conversation?
I mean, potentially, yes. And then it's still a massive enigma, isn't it, as to the quantum nature of the universe, that we can have this supposed spooky action at a distance, or, you know, it's not, it defies any kind of logical understanding, really.
So maybe do you mind explaining on your own words the double slit experiment and also this idea of entanglement?
Yeah, so the double slit experiment shows that that depending on how we observe it, light can behave as either a particle or a wave, and is both and neither simultaneously.
If we observe or not.
Yes,
But-
and also
yeah.
then we have non-locality, you know, quantum action at a distance. Those that two particles that are once joined together are forever entangled. So when then you observe one of those two entangled particles, the other particle then collapses and becomes the opposite of that. So irrelevant of distance and time, when you observe the state of one, the other is then known.
Yeah.
And we call that kind of a quantum action at a distance.
So define the idea of speed of light, because it's immediate.
Yes, it is immediate. It's not an information transfer as far as we understand it, but they are entangled and beyond space and time. And, you know, current thinking in physics is that time itself is an illusion, because there is no ultimate time. There's no kind of, it's all relative. So, you know, quantum physics currently makes like parapsychology look like a tea party, and yet psychologists struggle to entertain the ideas from parapsychology, and yet they just need to peer over the quad and have a look at what's going on in physics, and they shouldn't be so terrified, you know.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah. But so the question is, you know, by observing or not, it behaves like a particle or a wave. But this is binary, observing or not. What we still don't know is the quality of the observation, right? Because what I suspect is happening is that when you observe with a certain state of mind, things behave in a certain way. But so you were guys high all the time, and you were traveling with the Chevy, and you're saying that you would like manifest things. But so can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so there becomes a particular quality of mind when you spend too long in altered states, whereby, you know, if you are very positive and upbeat, you know, everything, it remains in flow, things just fall into place, you meet the right person at the right moment that gives you the thing you need, you know, in that moment. And yet if things get a little bit dark, and if you are operating from a place of fear, you know, things get quite kind of
Sticky.
Yeah, very quickly. So like, it's like your state of mind very quickly attracts what it is resonating with, it would seem.
This is a huge concept
Yeah.
that people don't really understand or believe.
No, well, it has to be experienced to be believed.
Yeah. But imagine the impact on 7 billion people if this become a little bit more mainstream. So, for example, for me, there was a moment 2-3 years ago where I had to come to London often for a certain of boring administration. And I was playing this game with myself where I would not book a hotel. I wouldn't really even know on the calendar if it's like, is it spring break or holiday or bank holiday? So I wouldn't know how booked the hotel was. And I would just, after my meeting, just get into the States and just walking around and trying to manifest an empty hotel room.
Brilliant.
And it's incredible to what extent it's really, you can make it, I think you can make a trial according to your heart rate, to the negative thinking, to how you put yourself down, saying it's now, sometimes the meeting were long, so it was 7:30. It's like after the first rejection, you feel like, what am I doing? Book the bloody thing. But instead, when you stay optimistic, you keep your heart down, you stay with your connected breathing, then the hotel room appears.
Yes.
And I've done enough time to make it statistically robust.
Very good. Very good. Well, you've done the experiments.
I've done the experiment, but it's and now so again yesterday or 2 days ago, I rent a car, and I always get, for me, the rental car experience can get really tricky.
Yeah.
And that's my limitation. But anyhow, so I booked online. I find through a broker, I find Alamo, $50, like £35 a day for 3 days. Perfect. I go to Alamo, it's like, there's a blockage. And I was like, what do you mean there's a blockage? Yes, because you didn't pay. I was like, what do you mean? I would remember. I think they refer in 2017, I took the car to Burning Man.
I believe you.
You believe that I didn't pay?
I believe you were innocent.
Anyhow, I don't want to, but basically, similar thing. I feel my heart rate going up. I'm losing the car. I went to the other thing, and it was 5 times the price. And then they offered me an electric car, and then they couldn't explain me where to charge it. And then I catch myself in my stress mode. And as I calm down and I get the electric thing and I got a room, I arrived at this Airbnb and there was a plug to charge it just there in the house. And,
Perfect.
And yeah. But so where am I going with this?
It's like a state of mind.
It's like a state of mind. But as far as you know, there's been no trial done on this?
Well, then so the next part of the story is that whilst in Mexico, in the desert, on peyote actually, and this was near the end of the trip, and it was the end of the trip because myself and my buddy who I was with, we both had a vision on peyote in the desert of what we needed to do with our lives. So we'd both been kind of traveling and just together for eons, and it was like, okay, he had to go back and take on his family business, and for me, I had a calling to go and do a PhD and put back into the university what I thought was missing. And so then I did.
And the calling for PhD came in one of the sessions?
Just in the desert, alone, the two of us on peyote. And so for me, that was my calling. And it actually came from you indulged me a little story.
Totally. That's what we're here for.
Okay, this is great.
We love the story.
So my granddad, who was very elderly at this point, just after I finished my degree, he called me up and he said, okay, congratulations on doing your degree. I've got an idea for a PhD for you. I'm like, no. And he's like started telling me, and I'm like, hey, Granddad. And I was actually thinking, like, there's no way I'm doing a PhD. Also, I was just on the way out the door. And I was like, hey, look, Granddad, look, I'm going to be up in Leicester in a couple of weeks. I'll come and see you and you can tell me about it in detail. But all he had said is, well, I've got this idea for a PhD. It's about luck, fate, and the spiritual experience.
Luck and
fate and the spiritual experience. And I was like, okay, cool, this is great, but I'm not going to do a PhD. But
that's your father's dad?
My father's dad. And I was like, I'll come and see you in a couple of weeks. Sure enough, he fell over, broke his hip, ended up in hospital, and then just died a couple of days later. It was in his late 90s. And I think, he'd suddenly lost his independence in living, and because he was living on his own at this point, and then he just decided to die. And so he died. And it was like, I didn't get to see him and find out what his ideas were other than these 3 words. And so that kind of haunted me a little bit, obviously. And then as I was in the desert on peyote, it came to me, it's like, you need to go and study this for a PhD.
The same words came back?
Yeah. And it's like, I was kind of conscious of like, okay, that's what I've got to do. And then so I applied to a few kind of people in the UK who were doing research in parapsychology, because that seemed to be the best fit for this kind of topic. Certainly couldn't study psychedelics back then.
There was no
one
program
who would supervise it. No,
Yeah.
but that was also fit with what my granddad had said. And a few of them were like, well, I'd be interested in supervising you, but you need some funding. I didn't have any funding. I wrote off to this one. It was like a job application, and so they were going to offer a lectureship and PhD at the same time. And so I wrote off and applied to them. I went back to Mexico. I popped back for a short while. I went back to Mexico. I was traveling, and I'd forgotten all about it. And then I had a dream. My granddad appeared in my dream next to the cemetery where he's buried, and he's there, and he's got these kind of...
In Mexico?
No, in the UK.
Yeah.
And he's got these dreadlocks. I had dreadlocks at the time. He had these kind of dreadlocks and a dreadlock beard, but they were made out of solid silver and gold. And he was just laughing. It was like, he was just laughing hysterically. And sure enough, the next day I woke up and there's an email inviting me for an interview for this job,
Incredible.
So, okay, there's the money for the PhD, right? So yeah, it came about in its own magical way.
So it was the Department of Parapsychology in Greenwich.
No, so that was at Northampton,
Northampton.
which at the time was one of the few universities in the UK, and still is, which studies parapsychology.
And your thesis was on what?
Luck, the psychology of luck as it relates to psychic experiences, precognition. So I effectively did your experiment, but in a formal way. So I looked at...
I told you we had the same interest, but you went deeper.
exactly that. So it's like, so what is it about, the idea was that when we have an experience where things go our way, we tend to just say, oh, that was lucky, right? But that's just, it's kind of like we use it like a euphemism. The idea was maybe we use luck as a euphemism for when we're actually exerting our will on the world, or precognition, either that or we are, knowing what's going to happen and therefore change our behavior in an unconscious way. So it's the idea that psychic abilities, if they are real, work unconsciously most of the time in subtle ways, so that we might just say, oh, that was lucky, or I'm a lucky person, If you have a bit more kind of awareness about it, you might say, well, that was down to my state of mind, or I made it happen, or I predicted that was going to happen. But generally I tested this idea, and I asked people how they believed, what they believed luck was, and whether or not they thought they were lucky or not. And sure enough, in this experiment, and then it was a precognition task, which they didn't know they were doing. And if they did well, they got erotic images. And the better they did in the test, the more erotic the images got. Okay. Whereas if they did badly...
The test was to guess something.
Yeah, they just had to do a preference. They got shown pictures of fractals, and they just had to say which one they liked the most.
Okay.
So they were
Just preference.
Very neutral. Oh, just very quickly, which one do you like the most?
But so how do you value better and worse?
Okay, so then the computer, whilst they pick their preference, the computer randomly selects one as the target out of 4, and they don't know this. And so if they get a match with the computer, that's a hit, right? And so we did a number of trials, and by chance alone they'd get 25% right. If they got more, they got a reward.
I see.
If they got less, they got not really a punishment, but we got them to do one of these really boring cognitive psychology tasks where they have to just like a vigilance task. It's really tedious.
Yeah, like I did for the DMT experiment.
Exactly, those ones. And then, so the worse they did, the longer they had to do that.
Yeah.
And the better they did, the more
erotic
erotic the images got. Turns out it worked really well, this experiment, And
but what was the result?
Well, first of all, that people got the erotic images more often than chance.
Yeah.
That the people who liked watching erotic images got more of them, and that the people who thought they were lucky did much better as well.
Interesting.
And, you know, reliably, people would come in and say, like, I'm actually a really unlucky person. I'm going to flunk your test. And sure enough, they got like really, really poor results. You know, it was quite reliable.
Wow.
So that how we view our luckiness, you know, like, are we lucky? Or as a euphemism for our underlying ability to be optimistic about the world and make things happen in our favor, was borne out in this experiment, which is my PhD thesis, basically.
Super interesting.
Thanks. I don't talk about that much.
Yeah, no, but this is so interesting because it's gonna, like, you know, I did. And there was a moment where I needed some optimism and boost of self-esteem, so I went to a Tony Robbins workshop, and he's done that for 40 years.
Yeah.
So all this, it's all statistic based, all data. So everything he says is not woo-hoo. It's like based on 40 years of data with millions of business people. And he says that the success of a company, it's 80% the psychology of the leader, which is your thesis, my hotel experiment.
Yeah.
But because why I think it's important? I think it's important because we know, even as personally, so many people that, they're sabotaging their own existence.
Yeah.
And if this kind of knowledge and wisdom would be a little bit more accessible. Anyhow, we are talking about it. So we're doing a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so you discuss your thesis and then you start teaching at Greenwich immediately, or?
Well, then it took me about 7 years to do my PhD.
Because you were doing other thing in between?
I was taking a lot of psychedelics.
Yeah.
And,
but honestly, I'm a little bit frustrated because you've been, I would like, and I understand if it's uncomfortable, but can you dig a little bit deeper on, because you mentioned that, okay, you saw the cultural conditioning, you saw how society and media manipulate you, you experienced these synchronicities, this state of mind affecting the outcome of your reality out there. But is there any other is there any other insight on your psychology, your subconscious, your relationship with other, your relationship with mind at large, in all these where were you going with all these psychedelic trips?
Well, trying to explore the nature. I see myself as an ontologist in a way, that trying to understand the nature of reality. What is our existence, and how does reality actually genuinely function beyond all of the cultural conditioning?
And did you find some answers?
Well, in a way, my PhD was exploring that, to see the world through the eyes of a shamanic lens, and so my mission has
interconnected of all things,
and how that perhaps everything is inherently sentient, and that we are conscious agents in a world that is not just reduced to material billiard ball engineering, and is actually inherently inert and alive and relational, right? And had numerous experiences like that, which would tip me into that kind of shamanic worldview.
Where you felt being an animal or a plant?
Yeah, many times, sometimes.
Yeah.
My first experience. So, having read a lot around shamanism and explored it a lot, I was very much open to the idea of the sentient other, right? That even plants may be sentient. Okay, everybody's fairly happy to accept animals are probably sentient, most of them at least, But what about plants? Are they also sentient? And I was kind of okay with this idea. And then this one time, a friend had given me salvia, and it was before anybody knew about salvia in particular. And he said it was the first time he'd given it to anybody. He'd come from Mexico with it. He'd been given it by this Mazatec shamaness, and so he brought it over, and it's you're going to be the first person in the UK to try this. And sure enough, I got turned into a shrub, into this kind of little spiky shrub. And I was at Glastonbury Festival at the time, and all the grass and all the trees and everything that photosynthesized started laughing at me. They were like inside splitting fits of hysteria, like, now you know what it's like to be a plant like this. And I was literally paralyzed. And I was like, oh my God. And the thing with salvia and a lot of these psychedelics is that it's hyper real. It feels absolutely real at the time, and it's like, oh my God, I'm stuck like this now. And it's like, we take it for granted, our perceptions, our state of consciousness, and then to feel like you've been turned into a shrub and you're not coming back, it really changes your relationship to that world that I was in. And for me, it was the idea that plants have sentience, and that sent me off on a whole other kind of rabbit hole journey into salvia and shamanism.
Yeah. And then I heard you saying also the story of Merlin, who was turned into a fungus.
Yeah.
And you had a couple of other examples, someone into a tiger. And what I heard is that, you mentioned that in the scientific method, we have the opposite approach to dissect things. And, we reduce them and we want to be as objective and detached as possible to understand them, where maybe, the shamanic approach of becoming the thing you want to study would allow you to understand it.
Absolutely, yeah.
But so how would... what kind of... let's assume science would then be open. We're talking, I don't know, maybe in 100 years.
I hope much sooner.
I don't know. It has been 50 years from the 60, and it seems like, But, okay. So, but what would be the repercussion on the structure of society if science would incorporate this kind of exploration? Or rather, the ontology of the West is this idea of consciousness being an epiphenomenon of the brain, right? So people confuse when they heard scientific materialism, they think about material things, but scientific materialism is... You explain it better than me. What is it?
So so the metaphysical position of materialist reductionism is the idea that brain effectively produces consciousness, or that consciousness is typically secondary or is an illusion, but that the material physical world, i.e. the brain, is kind of the primary source of our existence, right? Our sense of experience. I think it is actually related to materialism in the kind of consumer sense as well, in a way, because if you think that the world is inherently physical and that the physical only exists, and that consciousness is just a kind of a production of that or a side effect, it allows you to be more engaged with the material world and desire to consume and buy things and exploit the world for its natural resources, right? If you desacralize or take out the sentience from the material world,
you can extract.
You can exploit it and extract it. As, Bacon famously said, in the start of the scientific revolution, nature is there to be tortured until she reveals her secrets, right? So I think the two things are aligned in a way. And so I think having this kind of opening up to different epistemologies, as in the shamanic epistemology being how we obtain knowledge, will only help us to expand science. It will maybe take us beyond our preconceptions. And the trouble is with science is brilliant. Science, I am absolutely a fan of science. Science, unfortunately, is confused. It's like most scientists think science has a particular belief system.
No, it's just a method.
It's methods. It's a scientific method. Unfortunately, a lot of scientists think that you need to be a materialist reductionist. That's just a working model, which helps explain or understand reality. But it's not necessarily the ultimate nature of reality, okay? And most scientists confuse that. The methods itself are good, and that is deduction, induction, hypothesis testing, and objectivity, right? And that's got to a good, okay, we've helped us like create and discover many things. And it's good for testing ideas, particularly the hypothetical method. And it allows us to kind of validate whether or not the things we're testing are useful beyond biases, and that we're not just deluding ourselves about the nature of our theories, right? But it's not particularly good at coming up with new insights or worldviews. It's good at testing ideas. It's good at, but most kind of, so a lot of science just does that. It takes existing ideas, it tests them, it expands them a little bit, and it moves very, very slowly. Then you have these visionaries who come along who usually have one foot in the mystical world as well. And they have these kind of great leaps of ideas, you know, like Einstein's ideas took decades before they were tested through observation and objective science, right? But he was a visionary. He saw these things. And he also said that the same kind of thinking that got you into a problem is not the same thinking that's going to get you out of that problem. And that's what goes for our current relationship with the natural world. You know, our ecosystems are in a total mess because of this materialist, reductionist, materialist thinking and extractivism and using the world for its resources, right?
Yeah, the animal extinction, the species extinction.
We are in the biggest wave of mass extinction. And so like these kind of shamanic worldviews that are more relational, you know, indigenous worldviews are relational. And it comes with this kind of metaphysics too. If you want to know something, you turn into that thing. It's like the extreme state of empathy, like you identify with the thing you are studying, and therefore everything is relational.
Okay, but so, you know, like, as you know, of course, the FDA rejected phase 3 for MDMA. And, you know, for me, even if I was letting the environment brainwash me that everything's going to happen and we are ready, and then next one's going to be the mushroom, I'm not completely surprised because the Western health method is a very reductionist, symptoms-based, and even placebo, right? What we call placebo, there seems to be like almost a side effect, which really it's really self-healing.
Yeah.
So how do you think we're going to be able to, okay, we agree that we need to review the current ontology to be able to integrate this compound that show us an animistic and panpsychismic view of reality where we're all connected on a subatomic level. But so how are we going to do that?
I love that sentence. How are we going to introduce this new medicine into an archaic system that basically shows us we're panpsychistic? Great.
If you were the prime minister of the planet, what would you do in terms of, you know, changing this ontology?
Well, would I try changing the ontology? I would put out I would try and publicize and make a request to see our limitations, you know, to identify that science is a method, it's not a belief system.
Okay, starting with the limitation of the current system.
The limitations, and then showing the kind of potential benefits of having other worldviews, like indigenous perspectives, such as our experiment looking at creative problem solving with LSD, and how some of those people, like Merlin, would have these perspectivist experiences where they, for instance, Merlin became the fungus. Another guy, like, got down there with his tectonic plates and saw all his geological data over millions of years evolve in real time. You know, having those kinds of perspectives, shift in our perspective, takes us outside of our angular, you know, objective, very left brain human worldviews, and allows us to be more permeable and open to different worldviews, right?
But so, I know you said this story a million times, but just explain again what happened. You know, why is it useful for Merlin and for the tectonic plate scientist to have that revelation? And what was the revelation?
Well, for Merlin, it was that he'd been working on this relationship between a plant and a fungus for 3 years for his PhD at Cambridge, and it was assumed to be parasitic, and he didn't know otherwise, but he wasn't sure.
What does it mean? Sorry, to be parasitic.
Parasitic, whereby the plant, because it doesn't photosynthesize, the plant gets all of its energy directly. Doesn't get its energy from the sun, like 99% of all of the plants. It seemingly gets its energy from the fungus. And so it thought that the plant was a parasite on the fungus.
I see.
Now, he didn't really know, he'd been studying it for 3 years, and then he came to a lab, we gave him LSD, and, he had the experience of being the fungus growing inside the rootstock of the plant. And it gave him a different perspective on a problem he'd been thinking about for 3 years. And it was like, okay, he had a kind of a bit of an aha moment in that there's something, I'm not going to ruin it and say exactly what happened. You have to read the book.
Yeah, you have to read the book.
But it changed his perspective. And it's like, okay, there is potentially something in it for the fungus in relationship to the plant.
I see.
And so that didn't give him the truth of the nature of this relationship necessarily, but it gave him the idea, which can now be explored in the usual way with the usual scientific objective methods, right?
A different perspective.
A different perspective, which has generated ideas for, okay, this might be the nature of their relationship. So, and the same way in which Kary Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize in Biochemistry for discovery of polymerase chain reaction, he discovered this particular way of replicating DNA by having experiences with LSD, whereby he's able to kind of zoom in on the molecule and fly alongside the molecular structure. And that gave him the insight, he said, for developing PCR. This is effectively an experience of perspectivism induced through psychedelics, which is what indigenous people do. Right?
Yeah. And then there was this guy who was trying to explain these tectonic plates for many years, and then in the LSD, he just saw it, he visualized it.
Yeah, he basically had like several million years of tectonic plate data, and he basically went down to the bottom of the ocean and saw his data, in a kind of up close, immersive way, like in a kind of VR kind of thing, just like evolving according to his data, and he realized that some of his data was wrong. And that's why he couldn't find a good model to explain the evolution of these tectonic plates.
Okay, I want to go back in you being the prime minister of the planet and what to
God
do.
Help us.
but just to finish on this, okay, how do you explain, like one thing I remember from all this fMRI that you guys did at the Imperial College.
I was just a participant, but yeah.
Yeah, it's this idea that the default mode network gets subdued, so there is less activity, and Aldous Huxley already was saying that the brain being a reducing valve, and also in breath work the same area gets subdued. Is this idea that the brain gets out of the way and more knowledge can come in?
Yeah.
But so where this knowledge come from? Like this.
Well, that's the next question, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a way, where does it all come from? And I guess again that depends on your perspective, right? On your worldview.
What's yours?
Well, mine's a bit different. I don't buy into materialist reductionism. I try and be agnostic, okay, which means then I'm open to, okay, materialist reductionism is a good explanation to a point, but it falls down, and maybe shamanic perspectives are also useful, or an animistic or panpsychist perspective. People like Eric Davis and Jeffrey Kripal are nicely diplomatic about this, and they refer to this, the imaginal, the realm of the imaginal, which isn't just the imagination, because that would imply it's just produced by our brains. And neither is it saying, oh, we're tapping into the collective unconscious. They're saying there's something which we can't quite grasp or fathom or pin down, and but can give us access to ideas or information which seemingly transcend, the usual boundaries of time and space, and potentially relationship too. But this isn't radical worldview for indigenous people.
No, that's
No.
quite not. It's not even controversial.
Exactly. And parapsychology, of course, brings us data
Yeah.
to substantiate that there can be times, or maybe we can do it very subtly at an unconscious level most of the time, where we can transcend time and space and we can access information. You know, was Carrie Mullis literally seeing the DNA somehow with it like in a kind of direct perception, or was it just an intuition that his mind had freed up through the use of LSD? But there are cases where people seemingly have genuine veridical information about things they shouldn't know about. You know, when people go to the Amazon, they drink ayahuasca, as did some of those early explorers, discover that their dad has actually died. You know, when they get out of the jungle, they found out it's correct. Or the guy I spoke to who was in his first ayahuasca ceremony and is having visions of his wife going into labor on the hospital bed, but she's only 5 months pregnant. And he's like, well, it must have just been
And then the baby was premature.
it was premature, you know. And the shaman knew. The shaman's like, oh, yeah, you better call your wife, you know.
Yeah. Rupert Sheldrake called it the morphogenetic fields.
Yeah.
Right, where you can store information, a little bit like the Akashic records.
Mhm.
Okay, but so even recently, Bernardo Kastrup has this theory of mind at large, where the ego is basically some reducing processes that get that, like with the Aldous Huxley reduction valves, that allow you to go through this reality, and then when you die, you lose this limit, these processes, and you can connect with life at large. And in one of these conferences, one of these workshops, I asked him, but so can you experience losing these limiting processes before you die? And he said, with psychedelics.
Yeah, I think I happen to agree. And certainly that's what it feels like, you know, and those principles, that model works well in helping understand some of our psychedelic experiences, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had experiences, for instance, on ketamine where I became like a point of consciousness. I'd lost my entire identity. I didn't know who I was, what I was. I didn't know what human was. All I was a free-floating point of consciousness. And then I remember encountering these, I was trying to kind of like verbalize it and, you know, put it into words, but it was more conceptual. And it was just like, oh, they're these kind of beings, these other things. They're like beings, they're like, and then slowly because I could perceive them. And then I realized, oh no, wait a minute, they're humans. And it was like, and then later, as it emerged, I became aware of the fact that I was actually looking at my own body, right, and my friend lying next to me, and it was like I was seeing humans for the very first time, you know, and thinking, my God, how strange we look! Like we're really weird-looking human beings. If you were come from a different planet and you saw humans for the first time, you'd think, wow, we're really strange, you know. And so having that experience of not even knowing what a human was and seeing it for the first time, and then realizing that's actually me lying on the floor and I'm seeing from a disembodied perspective, it very much feels like your consciousness can disconnect from your body in a genuine and tangible way. And you can have the experience of disembodied consciousness. Then, so how does that make us think and relate to the idea of death and what happens to our body? So yeah, I would agree with Bernardo on that at the very least.
Wow. Okay, but so going back, really indulge me on this experiment, this thought experiment. So you are the prime minister of the planet with unlimited resources. So you would first point to all the limitation.
Yes.
And then you would maybe just have a massive global information education campaign on all these trials, like, you know, like your PhD thesis, like the LSD for creativity, and we have enough to make a case.
Yes.
There is enough.
I would also engage indigenous peoples. I would bring them to our institutes or take our institutes to them, and, you know, and humbly kind of open-mindedly go, like, we're here to learn from you. What is your perspective on this? Very few people are, you know, in the whole psychedelic renaissance enterprise, very few people are actually going to indigenous peoples and asking them what they think. I mean, I can think of only a handful of examples. People like Simon Ruffle at Onaya, I nearly got the name wrong. You know, he is running these kind of naturalistic clinical trials with ayahuasca for treating veterans with PTSD. And he's asking the Shipibo shamans, okay, how do you think we should do this experiment? How do we interpret the findings that we've got? You know, and trying to marry that up with all this psychiatric, medical, scientific model, and there are total mismatches, and there are some matches as well.
This is happening now?
Yeah, it's doing it now, but this is long overdue. You know, this is
Yeah.
just like one research group. You know, where's everybody else doing this? You know, we should be open-mindedly like asking these people who've been using these things for hundreds, if not thousands of years, what is their take on what is going on?
Of course.
We need to humbly do that. And then also adopt some of the other stuff around how they engage with the natural world, you know, systems of reciprocity. You know, you never take without first asking, you never take more than you need, you never take without giving something back in return.
Yeah. So starting like almost high school dedicated to indigenous wisdom, like universities and center and
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. This friend of mine is open a Shipibo consulate in New York.
Excellent.
But so what I'm thinking about Mao Tanka did the DMT experiment.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still under some media embargo. Can you say?
Probably. We've probably blown that right now.
No, but the fact that it's gone, I think, is known. But do we know if it? What was the reaction?
I don't know the outcome as yet, but I think what it is good is it's really great for perhaps the first time that we are seeing modern neuroscientific psychedelic research where they are enlisting, you know, well-established shamans into the research protocols and asking them what their experience is and how they interpret it. Yeah, this is only now just starting to happen, and I'm really delighted to see that. It's a kind of an invitation and a start to having more of a relationship with the indigenous peoples and worldviews around psychedelics and the brain and healing and everything, which is great.
Yeah. It's a difficult job to be the prime minister. But, you know, maybe even starting in elementary school, you know, having all this option between, you know, religious studies and maybe have shamanic studies and start opening the door to these children that there is other things that meet the eye, that the impact of, you know, that the mind can affect the structure of matter and,
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying we push a particular worldview because that's always tends to go wrong in the past. That's how we end up in these intellectual cul-de-sacs. But that we should have a plurality, we should have an openness, we should have a curiosity and inquiry into these things without just putting up barriers, you know. And I think that's a good first step, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, everybody's reality is indigenous tribes from different parts of the world will have slightly different takes on it, you know, and there's no one ultimate reality, but to embrace a plurality of perspective, have a real perspectivism, you know, I think that's that will help just help us see how interconnected we are and how little we actually know and how blinkered we can be, I think.
There's different plurality of belief, but I think the common idea is that there is something higher. Maybe higher, there's something, you know, this idea that you want to develop some sort of reverence for some kind of power that are, I wouldn't say higher, but maybe like, you know, I don't know what's the right word. And now, you know, I see there is more and more leadership course based on this idea of like, you know, the leader in reverence. I think the moment that you take the ego out of the equation, then immediately there's this positive effect of reverence and trust. And that can be one of the antidote for this state of affair that we have in this such a polarized society.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, it's about kind of relationality and connection, and just, if it needn't even be higher powers, but if you could see the sentience and the sacredness in the other, whatever the other is, like it becomes more problematic to exploit them.
Yeah, yeah. The last thing I want to ask you a comment on is, like you said about your granddad, if you indulge me on a little story. It's a little embarrassing. I didn't know if I wanted to share it or not.
Come on.
So, we mentioned briefly the DMT injection experiment where Imperial College invited a indigenous shaman. So I was part of the experiment, and our friend Anton has been sponsoring it with the hope that we could connect with some beings or entity that he thinks maybe like us, maybe not, that they are independent sentient beings, that, with the right approach, you can interact with them and even them maybe ask for help. And so I felt all the pressure of delivering the entities, but I didn't get any entities. And this might be a little embarrassing, maybe too much information.
No,
We'll discuss with the
this.
guys if we have to cut it off or not. But so the day before, I was really anxious. And so, my go-to things for anxiety has been in the past, like the cannabis or a wine or masturbation.
Or all three.
Or all three. And so at the time, I had already stopped alcohol and cannabis.
Okay.
And I surrendered to that stupidly, and so my DMT trip intravenous for 40 minutes was about the signal is disturbed because you have been leaking energy.
Okay.
And so since then, I signed up to a mystery school that works with that energy, and I've been going now, almost twice a year. It's a 1 week long retreat, and there's different exercise around sexual energy, and it's called Shamanic Spiritual Sexual Mystery School.
Right.
And there was one exercise where, again, I can't give too much information because there is some confidentiality, but there was a very intimate exercise, and the first time I did it, it was there was men and women. There was gender distinction. The second time there was not, and so I was really uncomfortable with the idea of engaging in this session with a man. Especially there was one man which I didn't like, and then of course
that's the one you got.
That's the one I got. and I was and then I was thinking, oh my God. Okay, maybe I could receive it, but give it this. No way. No way. But then, the guy went to me immediately, said, listen, I know exactly how you feel. Don't worry. Don't push your boundaries. Don't do anything you're not comfortable. I hear you. I see you. And it makes me super comfortable. And already I started getting emotional. And so I start doing this. We start with a massage. And, sometimes in this context, when there is you massage a woman, sometimes you get a bit concerned because you don't want to be too strong or too soft. They don't want to go too close to undesired play. It's a lot of pressure. But with a man, I was just in the flow. So I was like, that's a good start.
Yeah.
And then when we got that happened for a while, and then he starts crying. He says, like, I'm full of gratitude just for a massage. And that really affected me. And I was like, wow. And there was like this strong bond. Then when we arrived closer to the key part of the session, I asked I asked help to one of the helpers. I said, listen, I'm really uncomfortable, but I want to do it. I feel on the floor. So they helped me with, the gloves, and I didn't do the full thing, but I did much more than I ever thought.
Okay.
And the guy was crying like a baby, and I started crying. I had like
Beautiful.
For 2 hours, one of the biggest release. I've done also a lot of psychedelics, but so what I think happened there, the way I interpret it, it was like a energetic portal that opened, and it was transpersonal. You see, I have goosebumps because
Beautiful.
the guy. That what we both experienced had nothing to do with me and him. Not it was a transpersonal energy that was created. And so where am I going with this? I feel that this is, I don't know if you've been interested on transpersonal sexuality or because what's your relation with transpersonal phenomenon? Is how can you comment on what happened? What do you think happened?
Wow, wow. I mean, by its definition, transpersonal is going beyond the normal ego identity and having a deeper connection with some kind of other. And that sounds exactly what happened, whatever that other may be, another part of yourself, or something spiritual, like it happened, and that is transpersonal. So it could be many, many, many things, right? But it also is open and includes a spiritual realm of other.
But so that's a psychedelic experience.
Yeah.
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 But so, because that's another thing, I don't know how much you studied sexuality in your studies, but,
Not formally much.
not formally, not academically, just empirically.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's another aspect of, there is the psychedelic revolution, and then there is this, they call it Tantra, Neo-Tantra, sexual liberation, which is also a big phenomenon. I feel the excitement in that department like I was feeling in ayahuasca 15 years ago.
Amazing.
And so, do you have any, do you care to comment on that or not really?
Well, again, it can also be a release, isn't it? It's about kind of breaking down on normal boundaries and transcending those and just going beyond our kind of normal societal constraints, I think, in many ways, Tantra as a practice is about breaking down our usual conceptions, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that in itself is a release. Anything that takes us out of ourselves and beyond our constructed world is a
because
release.
still talking about you being the prime minister of the planet and me being your advisor, I like psychedelic. They're incredibly changing the world already. We feel the ripple, but it's not for everybody.
No.
But sexuality is.
Yes. Yes.
So I just wonder that also. I'd love to be that. I'd love to create more media and more more accessible campaign on sexuality and presence, sexuality and sacredness.
Yeah.
And like in psychedelic, I see a lot of overlapping and similarities.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. And I think, and with all the, the same potential pitfalls as well, in
The same pit, because
yeah,
whatever is powerful can be
and,
abused.
yeah, absolutely. And it's like
Exactly.
clarity is about boundaries and consent and this kind of stuff.
Exactly.
But, when the boundaries start to dissolve, those kind of like, that's when we need to have, clearer consent. But yeah, absolutely. Anything that can help us go beyond ourselves is a step in the right direction of growth, not just for ourselves, but everybody ultimately.
Yeah.
And sex is one of those paths for sure, and which has been, made banal in many ways through kind of pornography
and secularized.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think there's a
So
lot.
we have 10 minutes left. Let me finish with your biography because I got so excited with everything that. So what's up? What happened now? 7 years. You were doing some psychedelic in between. You were doing some work. You finished the PhD, and then you decide to go teaching. You go back teaching in.
Yes, I mean, I had been doing some teaching throughout that time as well, but then it was ultimately the mission download had been to put back into the academy what I found was missing, and therefore, I joined the department at Greenwich, but
It's a department of psychedelic.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's a psychology department.
Psychology.
We're teaching on undergraduate psychology degrees and research, and everybody's research interests are very much within the normal bounds of psychology. I'd committed double career suicide by studying psychedelics and parapsychology.
But still today.
Well, less so now. I mean, psychedelics now are a hot button topic.
They attract the grant that I was rejecting, right?
Yeah. Everybody wants to be, well, not everyone, but a lot of people want to be psychedelic researchers. They get a lot of traction. They get a lot of attention. It's a good career move even for researchers because you You get a lot of high impact journal articles if you do psychedelic research. You know, that's only in the last 10 years. Like, prior to that, it was like a kind of career suicide, as was parapsychology. Parapsychology was actually more respectable back then than psychedelics, but now psychedelics is very respectable almost. But I was keeping quiet about my interest because it was still very, very taboo. And then only slowly over time, you know, you kind of, it reveal what your intellectual interests are. You know, most of your colleagues don't pay too much attention, but for instance, we put on Breaking Convention, the second one, our psychedelic conference at Greenwich, and the guy in the media department, who it turns out had taken a lot of acid when he was younger and was really into it, we decided to splash it across the university webpage. We're putting on this psychedelic conference, and then suddenly all my colleagues were coming along. Suddenly everybody knew what I was interested in, and I get like this little knock at my door individually, one by one. One of my colleagues had come to the door, and
do you have someone else?
Yeah, well, kind of. Yeah, they'd look both ways, you know, down the corridor before they'd stick their head around the door and go, "Hey, so this conference you're doing looks really interesting. Did I ever tell you about the time?" And then I began to see that actually nobody really had a problem with it, and in fact, privately, most people were actually intrigued and interested and into it, right? But publicly, people would have this, like, they wouldn't talk about it publicly. They were worried what their colleagues think. And I found out that pretty much everybody thinks the same thing, right? So it's kind of like discovering the difference between a private and public persona. And I think a similar thing happens with parapsychology as well. You know, nobody wants to be that person sticking their head over the parapet, doing this research or even talking about it. But privately, a lot of people are really interested in it and don't just, you know, discount it out of hand, right? And so we started putting on this psychedelics conference, which in a way is also, you know, I see psychedelics as a vehicle for getting these more exceptional experiences into the mainstream academic discussion as well, because the cork's out of the genie's bottle, right? Once you start looking at the experiences people are having with psychedelics, you can't just say it's all a hallucination, right? Oh, it might be a hallucination, or if you call it hallucination, but then, you know, the more hallucinatory your experience is, i.e. the more mystical your experience, the better that is for clinical outcomes. You can't just then demonize it or pathologize it. You have to openly engage with it and say, well, look, this seems to be not pathological. It's the opposite. In fact, it seems to be part of people's better mental health and well-being, right? Exactly. So we should openly, at least open-mindedly, explore it, if not embrace it. Right? So it's a Trojan horse in many ways, psychedelics, for exploring these transpersonal realms and our relationship to the other.
Yeah. And so what really excites you these days?
Well, I like the way that a lot of this research is now opening up to the exceptional experiences, as I call them. I don't think there's been enough work done in that area. You know, people measure the mystical experience in clinical trials, and it nearly always predicts better outcomes. In fact, always predicts better outcomes. But nobody's like particularly drilling down into it. You know, people are looking for biological mechanisms. So in my own research, we've been pioneering like work into nature connectedness, how psychedelics make people feel more connected to nature, looking at the underlying transpersonal experiences, which are primarily or often driving those deeper connections. I started doing some research into experiences of interspecies connection and communication that people have, just to bring that into the conversation. Yeah. I want to explore more about perspectivism and how, you know, a quarter of Westerners who took ayahuasca in my one survey had the experience of transforming into another species, right? No one's talking about that. No one's researching that. And yet these kind of experiences of perspectivism not only can help, you know, shift people's worldviews and connection to the natural world and their perspectives on reality and metaphysics, but also can have uses, you know, in the way
for the environmental movement,
exactly.
To give a voice to the...
But to give a voice and also to see that, you know, they can change how we do science. As Einstein said, we can't think in the same way around ecology. We need to have these experiences, where we go, okay, if I can have an experience of being the fungi growing inside the rootstock of this plant, like we maybe need to give this fungus a bit more credibility and a bit more credit for its own existence and sentience, and it'll change. The more we stop thinking like humans, separate from nature, and being part of the ecosystems, the better that is for our global ecosystem. So
yeah. But so okay, two advice. One, to people that hear this conversation and read so much about psychedelic and maybe doesn't have the right support group or the connection, and they just want to do it on their own.
Yeah.
Is this something that you strongly discourage, or maybe, ayahuasca can be so many different directions, even on low dose, but psilocybin LSD, you can, if you start small, do you think it's dangerous even to start small? If you start with 10 microgram, 20 microgram, like half a gram of mushroom, would you still cautious people to start small, finding a sitter? I know it's a tricky question, but
I mean, I would first of all, just professionally, I have to say that we can't eradicate risk. Okay, there's always going to be some
even
risk.
on small dose.
Even small doses. I mean, small doses don't tend to. I mean, the thing about classic psychedelics, like psilocybin, LSD, very low toxicity, very few physiological side effects. They may potentially have some cardiac risk. We don't know for taking habitually. That hasn't been established yet. It's a supposition. But potentially, they're at low doses, at microdoses, they're effectively pretty safe. Nothing's without total. There's nothing risk-free. Even water can be toxic if you have too much, right? So there is always some risk. And I think, low doses, microdosing may have some benefits, but you're not getting those big psychological shifts, insights, metaphysical challenges, delving into your own personal unconscious. And that's where the real juice happens, the magic.
But the reason why I mentioned the macrodose is because, what I would personally feel inclined to advise is like, don't take anything that you don't know where it's come from and how much is it.
Yeah.
Once you have a clear sense of the purity and the doses, then you can do an incremental strategy.
You can, and that's always a safe, I think, especially if you're working on your own. Is always titrate the dose upwards.
Yeah.
Like Albert Hoffman started on what he thought was the lowest possible dose and ended up taking 200 micrograms of LSD. But, the idea is that you start small and you gradually increase. But yes, the basic homework is like, where did you get it from? What's its provenance? Is it what it's meant to be? Do your homework on what the substance does, how long it lasts for. Are there any contraindications? All of that stuff is
and
basic.
your intention while you're doing it, and keep a journal, and be serious, like you're learning something, like learning a new skill.
And people who have most of the risks are psychological with psychedelics. There's very few physiological side effects or toxicity if you've got the right substance. Some research chemicals are toxic, like N-bomes, which could be passed off as LSD. People do die from taking that. So,
and ibogaine is very hard on your heart.
Absolutely. So,
and 5-MeO, even, I can mention 4 people I know personally that had flashbacks and nightmare for years after.
So, actually, MEO, something like half of users have some kind of reemergence,
side effects.
Well, they have a re-experience, basically. For most people, that's benign, but some people can have long-term flashbacks, definitely. So you can do your homework, know what it is you're taking, know what the risks are, and then you would want to titrate your dose. Ideally, you get it from a trusted source. You do it with people you trust. That's the best way. Like, go by recommendation.
Because, I would say go to a legal center, like in Amsterdam, but they're expensive.
They are expensive, and, some of them not always so good, Like, there are a lot of pop-up shamans and cult leaders out there, wannabe cult leaders as well. Some of the more expensive retreat centers, we keep on hearing horror stories. So, like, do your homework. Caveat emptor. Like, imagine you're buying a second-hand sports car,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
This is your own
Do the due
psyche.
diligence. Yeah.
Due diligence, exactly.
Yeah.
You know.
And for people that maybe with some agency, with some resources that wants to help this movement, what would you ask? Who would you ask them to donate or to start? Like focus on drug development, research, or education. Start an institute. Wealthy people that want to help this movement, that agree with us that they can really start awakening consciousness. How would you suggest they donate to Breaking Convention?
Yeah, absolutely. We're a charity, and we don't get much sponsorship or funding. But yeah, there are many organisations out there, and again, with different agendas. But like, there are many good organisations out there. Some are focused on research, some are focused on drug development, some have like ideas around reciprocity built into their engine. About giving money back to indigenous people, or these kind of community-based projects. There also needs to be funding for understanding like long-term negative psychological difficulties, integration. How do we deal with how do we mitigate the risks for those 1 or 2% who have prolonged psychological difficulties? How do we understand the risks? How do we mitigate them? How do we discover what helps with coping? So, like, not leaving behind those people who also struggle with their experiences. So, what works best under what circumstances? Bringing in indigenous people to the table. So, there's many organisations. I'd end up leaving some out if I tried mentioning any of them. Really.
Okay, but what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna ask you by email.
Sure.
And I'll put them on the show notes.
Yeah.
Because even like, for example, like the defense fund for my CERS, for example, if people get into legal problem, there's so many different ways that this movement can be helped, because it touches so many, the epistemological, the ontological, the educational, the health, the psychology.
Everything to do with humans, yeah.
Okay, last question.
Okay.
Where do you see yourself in 5, 10, 20, 30 years?
Oh, wow. I don't know. I mean, just kind of doing much the same thing I am doing now, maybe with more funding and a research center, and maybe doing less admin, but also, but like, hopefully that intellectually the will have moved quite some distance, as we already have in the 20, 25, 30 years I've been doing this. Things have changed dramatically. But I think we're still like only starting in many ways in some of these areas, and that is these kind of, we'll be more engaging with indigenous worldviews. We'll be more engaged with how we view ourselves and connect with the natural world. Maybe we'll have centers for exceptional experience and nature relatedness, and that
center to practice or to study?
Well, both. That we explore and understand the nature of exceptional transpersonal experiences more, and we engage with them, and it's embedded within the body, within the community, within the natural world, and not just intellectual exercises.
I mean, I don't understand. If I was a billionaire, that was the first place where I would... I mean, there's nothing more interesting than exceptional phenomena.
I agree.
I mean, why there is not billionaire putting billions into, like, this center that you just described? Like, weekend... what do you do this weekend? Oh, I'm partying, drinking. It's like, okay, I go to an exceptional retreat where I can try things.
There's maybe not those avenues yet. They are starting to emerge. Like UCLA, for instance, are building a purpose-built psychedelic research and therapy center that is kind of using ecotherapy. So it's kind of like a glass house with like loads of plants, tropical plants growing everywhere. It's like a kind of indoor-outdoor tropical clinical center, which is amazing. So this is a step in the right direction. So we're starting to see this kind of thinking coming through now. But it takes time.
David, thank you very much. If people love your dialectic, your mind, like me, how can they can get more of you? I mean, they can Google your name on YouTube. There's like 4 or 5 podcasts or more.
Yeah.
And then your book.
Yeah, my book Other Worlds I'd recommend. That's most of my own writing in there.
On Amazon.
Yeah, anywhere, disreputable booksellers. Yeah,
Yeah.
Amazon, Other Worlds.
Tell me the full title again.
Psychedelics: An Exceptional Human Experience, Other Worlds.
Nice.
And yeah, that's a good resource. And all my papers are online on academia.edu as well.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giancarlo.
Thank
Great
you.
to
That
see
was so much fun.
That was
Thank
great.
you.
Koka sunarai sunarayanti. 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 Koka sunarai sunarayanti.